All right, let's dive into this. Political economy, chapter 8. You know, it's actually a lot more interesting than it sounds.
Oh, absolutely. It's fascinating how government and markets interact.
Yeah, it's like there are these two forces that are always kind of pushing and pulling on each other.
Exactly. And the way they interact shapes everything, like how wealthy a country is or
Yeah.
how that wealth is spread around.
Yeah, where are some countries so much more equal than others?
That's a question political economy tries to answer.
Okay, so like what S political economy? I mean, really?
Well, you can think of it as the study of how politics and economics are all tangled up together,
Okay.
how governments try to steer the economy.
Through like taxes and stuff?
Yeah, taxes, spending, regulations, but it's also about how the economy pushes back on politics. Like how the economic trends can totally change what happens in elections.
It's true. Remember President George H.W. Bush
Oh, yeah.
won the Gulf War? Huge victory, but then lost re-election because the economy was tanking.
Exactly. So to get this whole political economy thing, you got to understand the different systems countries use.
Like, you mean like capitalism versus socialism, that kind of thing?
Well, it's more nuanced than that. Your textbook talks about four main systems: mercantilism, free market capitalism, Marxism, and socialism. Each one has its own, assumptions and rules of the game.
Wow, okay. Sounds like a lot. Can we, like, break down each of those systems?
Sure. Let's start with mercantilism. It's sometimes called economic nationalism. Think, way back, the age of empires.
Okay.
The basic idea is that a country's power comes from how much gold and silver it has.
Mm.
And to get rich, you got to export more than you import.
So it's like me first economics.
Kinda.
Yeah, you can say that.
Do we still see that today?
You do. Think about Buy American campaigns, trying to protect domestic industries and jobs.
Right, right.
It's tempting, but there could be downsides.
Like what?
Well, if everyone's trying to sell more than they buy, who's going to do the buying?
Hmm.
Can lead to trade wars, everyone loses? Makes sense. So maybe not the best system then. What about free market capitalism? Sounds a little more, free.
Yeah, free market capitalism is all about individual freedom, less government meddling in the economy. The idea is the market will, sort itself out.
Through supply and demand.
Exactly. And it's led to some amazing innovation, incredible economic growth. But, there are critics.
I bet.
One big concern is inequality. It can create huge gaps between the rich and the poor.
Like that example in the book, right? Where a poor country's tourism industry gets swallowed up by these huge foreign corporations.
Exactly. And without some rules, pure capitalism can be tough on the environment. You can see worker exploitation, lots of potential problems.
Okay, so we've got mercantilism and pure capitalism both have their issues. Now, I'm curious about Marxism. I feel like we still talk about that a lot, even though, it's over 150 years old?
You're right. Marx's ideas are still debated. He basically thought capitalism was inherently unfair.
Yeah.
That it creates a system where the rich just keep getting richer, all at the expense of the working class. Right.
He predicted there'd be a revolution. Workers would overthrow capitalism and set up a society where everyone shares the wealth.
Pretty radical stuff. But didn't communism, which was based on Marx, have some major problems?
Yes, it did. Huge problems. One of the biggest was that it often led to these totalitarian governments like the Soviet Union. No individual rights. The economy was totally controlled by the state, which made it super inefficient.
Yeah. I always found that interesting about communism. The idea, everyone equal, sounds great on paper, but...
But in reality, it's almost always a recipe for dictatorship and economic disaster.
Exactly.
It's complex, though. Lots of historical reasons why it failed. But it's important to remember that Marx's ideas were, they were often twisted by those in power.
Yeah, I guess that's always the risk with any ideology. So if pure capitalism and communism both have issues, is there a middle ground? That's where socialism comes in. The goal is to create a more equal society. They promote social ownership, or at least heavy regulation of the means of production. Try to balance the benefits of the market with, a safety net and more economic equality.
So are we talking about, these Scandinavian countries? They have all that free healthcare and education.
Exactly. Those are social democratic policies, a form of socialism that works within a democratic system. But even they face challenges like how to pay for all those social programs without hurting economic growth.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, this is really helpful. So we've got these four systems, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. How does all of this actually play out in the real world?
Well, that's where it gets even more interesting. Your textbook focuses on two very different countries, Germany and China.
Oh, that's a cool comparison.
It is. Germany, after what they went through with fascism and war, rebuilt their economy with the social market model.
Okay.
It mixes capitalist competition with strong social programs.
So for like a hybrid of capitalism and socialism.
Exactly. And then you have China, this unique system of state capitalism. The government plays a huge role, even though there's private enterprise.
It's crazy how China, a communist country, has become such a global economic powerhouse. It's like they found a way to make it work for them, at least when it comes to growing the economy.
They have. But you gotta also think about the concerns about human rights, inequality, and, environmental stuff.
Right. The trade-offs. Always trade-offs.
Always. That's a key takeaway here. There's no one perfect solution. Every country has its own history, its own political and economic situation that shapes its choices.
Okay, before we get into the specifics of Germany and China, I just want to make sure I've got this right. We've talked about four political economic systems. Mercantilism, which is all about maximizing exports. Free market capitalism with its emphasis on individual freedom and less government. Marxism, which is a critique of capitalism and pushes for a classless society. And socialism, trying to balance market benefits with social justice and more equality. Did I get it?
You got it. You ready to see how these systems play out in the real world?
I am ready to dive deeper.
So Germany, their story's really interesting, like how a country can rebuild after facing some, well, incredible challenges.
Yeah. I remember reading about that hyperinflation after World War I, what you said in the textbook, like prices were doubling every few days. It's hard to even imagine.
Total economic chaos. Social upheaval, like going to the store one day and the price of bread is like 10 times higher the next day.
Wild.
It makes people lose faith in the system, makes them, well, vulnerable to extreme ideas.
Which is what happened with the Nazis, right? They took advantage of that economic misery.
Exactly. Promised to return to greatness, but of course their brand of nationalism and control led to another war.
And after World War II, Germany was just, devastated, both physically and economically.
Completely. But they were determined to rebuild, create a new system that would, avoid the mistakes of the past. They wanted both economic prosperity and indeed social justice.
Okay, so that's where this social market economy comes in, the whole balancing act between capitalism and a safety net.
Exactly. They realized that pure capitalism, without any kind of, safeguards, could lead to inequality, instability. But they also didn't want a centrally planned economy like the Soviet Union, so they tried to find a middle ground.
It sounds like they were trying to, get the best of both worlds. Harness the power of capitalism, but protect people from its, potential downsides.
Exactly. And one of the key features of the German model is this thing called co-determination.
Co-determination.
It's where workers actually have a say in how companies are run.
Wait, really? How does that work?
Basically, workers elect representatives who serve on company boards, alongside shareholder representatives. It gives them input on wages, working conditions, even investment decisions.
Wow, that's really different. It sounds like a system designed to address some of the concerns Marx had about worker exploitation.
It does address some of those concerns. It's credited with fostering cooperation between, workers and management, contributed to Germany's economic stability.
But even Germany's system isn't perfect, right? Especially in today's world.
Right. Globalization creates new pressures. Companies face more competition from abroad. There's the question of how to maintain those social programs as the population ages.
Yeah, it sounds like even a system as successful as Germany's has to, constantly adapt.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No system is perfect. And that brings us to China. They took a very different approach.
Yeah, their story is crazy. To go from a mostly agricultural society to the world's second largest economy in a few decades, amazing. And they're still officially a communist country.
It is remarkable. Their model is often called state capitalism.
State capitalism. So a hybrid system?
Yeah, you could say that. The Communist Party is still in charge, but they've embraced market forces. It's unleashed incredible economic growth.
So communist in name only, but capitalist in practice.
In many ways, yes. They open up to foreign investment, allow private companies. They've become a major player in global trade. But the government still controls key industries. They set priorities,
So it's they're taking the parts of capitalism they like while still holding on to power.
That's a good way to put it. And it's a model that's been, well, praised and criticized.
I can imagine.
On the one hand, it's lifted millions out of poverty, transformed China, but there are concerns about human rights, the environment, the lack of political freedom.
Yeah, the textbook talked about those issues. It sounds like China's economic success has come at a cost.
That's a valid point. Highlights the trade-offs.
Always trade-offs.
Always. And that's one of the big takeaways from studying political economy, right? There's no magic bullet, no easy answer.
Right.
Each country's got to find its own path.
It's interesting, though, that despite how different they are, both Germany and China seem to have this similar vulnerability, what the textbook called the export trap.
Right. That's a really important point. Both countries have relied heavily on exports for their economic success. But what if global demand for their products drops?
Like putting all your eggs in one basket, right? If that basket breaks.
You're in trouble, exactly. And we've seen some signs of this vulnerability lately with the trade tensions between China and the U.S., for example.
So what can countries do if they're in this export trap? Can they shift away from exports without hurting their economies?
That is the question. For Germany, it might mean finding new markets, maybe trying to increase demand within their own country.
And for China?
It's more complicated. They need to figure out how to transition to a model that's more balanced, less reliant on exports, maybe focus more on domestic consumption.
But that sounds like it would require some major changes, right? Both to their economy and their political system.
It might. It's a tricky situation. They need to maintain growth and stability while also addressing the problems with inequality, the environment, and, political freedom. It's a huge challenge for them.
This whole export trap thing really highlights how interconnected the world is. What happens in one country can affect everyone.
Absolutely. It shows how important it is for countries to think carefully about their role in the global economy. Relying too much on any one strategy, whether it's exports or something else, can make you vulnerable.
So, looking back at these two countries, Germany and China, what are some of the key things we can learn from their experiences?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that there's no one right answer, no single solution that works for everyone. Each country has its own unique situation and has to figure out its own way forward.
Right. No magic formula.
Exactly. And I think another important lesson is that even systems that have worked well in the past need to adapt. Things are changing so fast, We've got climate change, new technologies, rising inequality. These challenges demand new thinking.
So we talked about these big systems, looked at Germany and China. But I want to zoom in a little. The book mentioned some interesting stuff about how China got to where it is now. They experimented a lot before landing on this state capitalism thing, right?
Yeah. Their path wasn't like a straight line. After the revolution in 1949, they first tried a command economy, like the Soviet Union.
A command economy, meaning...
It's where the government controls everything. What gets produced, how much, even the prices. Imagine that.
Wow. So total government control. Did it even work?
Not really. Turns out trying to manage a huge economy like that from the top down, it just doesn't work.
I can imagine.
Led to shortages, products were low quality, no incentive for innovation, and tragically, it contributed to that awful famine in the late 1950s.
Yeah, the book talked about that. Millions of people died. Hard to believe something like that could happen.
It shows how even policies that, maybe start with good intentions can have terrible consequences, especially when they ignore basic economic principles. And it's a stark example of how political decisions they can be literally life or death.
Absolutely. So how did China turn things around? Did they just give up on communism?
Not exactly. After Mao Zedong died, Deng Xiaoping took over. He saw the problems and started to make changes, introduced market reforms, but the Communist Party was still, running things.
So they kept the communist ideology, but started using some capitalist tools. That's a pretty big shift.
It was a risk, a huge risk, but it worked. They gradually loosened the government's grip, allowed private businesses, opened up to foreign investment. It wasn't overnight, but it set the stage for that massive growth they've had.
It's fascinating. They managed to combine communist ideas with capitalist practices.
Yeah.
Seems like they found a way to make it work, at least for their economy.
It is remarkable. But we can't forget the challenges. Inequality, environmental damage, lack of political freedom, those are still major issues.
Right. The trade-offs.
Always trade-offs. That's something to remember. Every system has them. No perfect system. Political economy is about figuring out how to navigate those trade-offs, finding a balance that, works for a particular society at a specific time.
Okay, that makes sense. We talked about China. What about Germany? What did the book say about their social market economy?
One of the key things about the German model is that co-determination thing. Remember we talked about that?
Yeah, where workers have a voice in how their companies are run. They have representatives on the boards, right?
Exactly. It's based on this idea that workers and management, they're not enemies, they're partners.
Okay.
Workers have a stake in the company's success. So giving them a voice can lead to more cooperation, more stability, you know, better results for everyone in the long run.
Makes sense. Sounds like a system that tries to avoid those problems Marx talked about with workers being exploited.
It does address some of those issues, helps make sure that workers benefit from economic growth, that they have a say in decisions that affect them. But like any system, it has its critics.
What do they say?
Some say it makes companies less efficient, less able to compete,
Yeah.
especially with, the speed of the global economy. Others worry it gives too much power to unions, which can push up wages and prices.
So again, it's all about finding the right balance.
Exactly. Always trade-offs. And with the global economy changing so fast, Germany's got new challenges too. Competition from places like China, new technologies. They have an aging population. Lots to figure out.
This whole discussion has been, well, eye-opening. The relationship between politics and economics is way more complex than I realized.
It's definitely more than just theories in a textbook. It's about real people, their lives, their hopes, how we organize ourselves as societies, how we share resources, how we make decisions that affect the future. It's important stuff.
It is, and it reminds me that we all have a role to play in this. The choices governments make about economic policy, it affects all of us, whether we realize it or not.
You got it. That's one of the most important takeaways here. We need to be informed, engaged. We need to understand this stuff, participate in the conversations that are shaping our world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This has been a fantastic deep dive, really helped me get a handle on all of this.
Glad to hear it. It's been great exploring these ideas with you. Remember, the more we learn, the better choices we can make, and the better chance we have of building a world that's, well, a better place for everyone.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll catch you next time.